We are an evolved panel from mental health and well-being to youth well-being and mental health in tech. I am Lauri Goldkind. I'm an associate professor of social work at the Graduate School of Social Service at Fordham in New York. I'm also the journal editor for the Journal of Technology and Human Services. I spend most of my time not with social work professors, which is a positive. I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves. Sheoran, can we start with you?
Sure. Thank you, Lauri. My name is Sheoran. I'm the Vice President of Global Development in an organization based in Oakland called ETR. I'm also the Managing Director of an organization that sort of has the main title words in its name. So I'm the Managing Director of YTH, or Youth Tech and Health, also based at the same place.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for sticking around. My name is David Ball. I am the director of the program Headstream. It's part of the company Second Muse, and we focus on really big challenges around social and environmental components of this world. And about a year ago, we started to really dig into looking and examining the interaction between youth and technology and the well-being that's coming out of that, and how the experiences of growing up with all of these social technologies.
Hello. Hi, I'm Vicki Harrison, and I'm a program director at the Center for Youth Mental Health and Wellbeing, which is in the Stanford Department of Psychiatry. I'm also a social worker, but not a clinical social worker, a macro social worker, like Lauri. And our center focuses on early intervention, increasing access, decreasing stigma, mostly for youth 12 to 25. We have a media and mental health initiative, so we've spent a lot of time looking at the impact of media on youth.
Thanks. So given that all of you are in youth services, broadly speaking, youth mental health, could you tell us about how you situate young people in your work, since none of us are exactly very young?
Do you want me to start? So I can start by telling you all a story that sort of highlights how young people are put at the center of the work that we do. We have, as an organization, a National Youth Advisory Board that sort of decides what our strategies should be and what we should be pursuing in terms of young people's health. And this group of young people all over the country, every year, several times a year, reach out to the local chapters to identify what are the major issues that are bubbling up in the lives of young people. And so 4 years ago, they came back to us and said mental health is becoming a really big issue, and within mental health, anxiety, sleep, stress, balance between school and work, and cyberbullying. These were the main things that were coming up. So we looked around and said, well, it seems like cyberbullying might be something we should be taking a look at, and we realized that there wasn't much data or statistics around what was happening in the world of cyberbullying and how it was impacting young people. So we did a national study, got a bunch of good data, brought it back with young people, and disseminated it, right? So build the evidence, inform providers, inform policymakers, and inform young people. At the same time, we can't just leave it at that. So the Huckleberry Youth Center, we were working with them. They're based in Marin County, and they came to us, and we went to them. It was I think a consensual effort where we worked with them, their high school students, for over 6 months to co-design a solution to first identify what are the main challenges in cyberbullying, and then figure out a solution with young people and see how we could create something that was innovative. Just to deconstruct that a little, young people came back and said that cyberbullying was one of those harassment issues that sort of follows you wherever you go. It doesn't stay on the schoolyard. It comes into your bedroom and stays there, right? And one of the biggest stress triggers for young people was the loss of control. They felt they couldn't control what was happening in their lives and what the rhetoric was and what was being said, right? So the main thing that they wanted to address was this issue around control. And they felt that if we could somehow design something that gave them control over the issue, even in a very simplistic, straightforward way, that would be very healing and coping. So they designed a tiny button that sort of lives behind the screen of your cell phone, and anytime you face or experience an incident of cyberbullying on Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, wherever, this button, you can make it live, and you can take a screenshot with a date and a timestamp, and it also identifies what platform that is happening. And then you can write a short note about it, how it made you feel, what the context was, etc. Just the very fact of documenting that incident was hugely helpful to young people to feel a sense of control. And at some point of time, we also gave them access to resources so they could document it and do nothing about it, or they could document it and share it with their adult allies, peers, or legal authorities or school authorities. And now it's going through we're trying to find monies to do an efficacy study about it. So essentially, that's a story to demonstrate how we center young people, or how young people can be centered in any work that we do around technology and young people's health.
Thanks, Sheoran. So I'll first say that I think Vicki and Sheoran have been actually incredible mentors to our program at Headstream. We've been focusing on this for about a year now. They've been working with youth around mental well-being, examining technology for a lot longer. And so right before we started, I was telling Sheoran and thanking him for some of the guidance and the learnings that we've brought to that table, and likewise with you, Vicki. The way that we've brought youth in, because we haven't built a board, we brought in some interns, but really the way we focus it is from a conversation of how do we turn this narrative from a narrative of fear, a narrative of technology as evil, a narrative of the unknown. And so I think the best people to answer that question are youth themselves, are the teenagers who are going to these platforms. They're finding really incredible creative places to be. They're telling their stories, they're creating, they're building, they're living on the internet. And so how are they doing that in the best possible way? And what we've tried to create through their voices, through their examples, through speaking to them, seeing them both as the innovators and the informers, is a program that will source those types of innovations, will accelerate those types of innovations so that we can create another narrative, a narrative where there are companies and there are solutions that are investable, that are market-based, that can bring positivity, can help youth grow up in a way that's really important. And one last thing to say is that I see some young people in the audience right now, and I think y'all should be up here. We're going to be talking about youth and well-being and technology. And so although you're not up here, shout out, right? Answer some of these questions, give that perspective. And we try our best to bring that voice and that inclusivity into the work that we do, both at events, through the material we produce, through the challenges, and through the innovations that we help create.
This one works.
This one better?
Oh, okay, sorry. This is better. We also really value youth voice and include it in all of our work. We actually are working on a big project to import a model out of Australia called Headspace into the United States. So we have an active youth advisory board that is really co-designing that whole initiative with us, and we meet with them every 2 weeks, get a lot of feedback from them. We've also done a youth mental health innovation challenge in 2017 where we brought about 100 high school students from the area together to innovate around some of the common challenges around mental health. So, and then we gave them a year of mentoring. So we love working directly with youth, and I get a lot of the ideas from the youth themselves, so we'll do my best to channel them.
Can you hear me? Sorry. Sheoran, you mentioned agency as sort of one of the things that young people really wanted, or the ability to turn off, right? I wonder if there are other promising practices or needs that you guys are seeing in the field as this sort of technology become more and more pervasive?
Absolutely. It's about agency, and I think we were talking in the green room that it's not about asking young people and saying, hey, be at the table, but just like David said, it's also important for people who are at the table to sort of give up our space and make space for young people and open those doors. But within the context of health, technology, and young people, for the longest time, our designers would sort of parachute into youth communities in the US and globally, and we would learn from them, come back, design, build something, and then launch it into the community. And while that may be successful in many cases, the chance that solution will actually create harm is quite big. That probability does exist, right? We also know that young people are not problems that adults have to solve for. Young people have the creativity, they have the wisdom, and they have the resilience. What they lack are resources. And it becomes the role of adults to bring those resources to bear in that community so they can really amplify their creativity, and they can be building and co-designing the solutions with us. So we used to practice human-centered design and realized it wasn't enough for us. So we looked at the other practice that we incorporated, which is around positive youth development. It has 8 elements of youth assets, and it really puts young people at the center of anything that you do. So we brought together positive youth development and human-centered design and created a new approach, which should be quite intuitive, honestly speaking. It's called Youth-Centered Health Design. It essentially says that we don't design anything for youth without youth being members of the design team. And I think Harini, who was in the Women in Tech panel earlier, also mentioned that, right? You can't just have designers who go in and do that work. While that might be true for some, if you're designing a shopping cart for young people in Walmart, maybe that might be true. But when you're looking at mental health issues, where the chance to do harm is really high, we cannot be designing without them. So if we do youth-centered health design, there's a very good chance that the solution is going to be authentic and truly based in the lived experiences of the young people, and hence more likely to be successful and not do harm.
Is this more the landscape question? Do you want to, or talk about agency?
I think
Promising practices? Yeah, I would just add, I agree that elevating the youth voice is really important. And I think what we hear a lot of from parents as well as youth is, you've probably heard this too, like parents will say, oh, I gave Johnny a phone when he turned 13 and then I lost him, or like now I have no control. And young people are sort of feeling the same way. At the design session I did with our youth advisory group this past week, one young woman told me that she deleted Snapchat and Instagram from her phone just this past Sunday because she just needed to take a break, and she's on it a lot. And she was describing how like she's so programmed to check it that she keeps opening Google Maps because that's the app that replaced Instagram. So like, and so she had a lot of fortitude and agency and forethought to take that break for herself. But she's also paying a cost for it, right? She's having to communicate with her friends in different ways. And so she had thought all that through. And she said, now I know I can just text someone if I need to reach them. But like, I think there's an in-between. Like, it shouldn't be all or nothing. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there for us to create the way that we use technology that's not like, I'm going to lose myself or my child to it, and how we can integrate it in a more balanced way.
This one was a really tough one for us at Headstream. We spent almost a year researching, and from that was a lot of academic conversations, a lot of kind of high-level conversations, and the types of innovations that we were thinking about working with were very much these top-down innovations where somebody knew exactly the part of well-being that was missing from these social technologies, and they knew exactly the types of tools they had to build into an innovation so that a youth or a young person could have that opportunity to interact or to take a risk or to make the right type of meaningful connection. What we started to realize was a lot of those innovations that exist that are very focused in on one of these components, whether it's protective factors, whether it's building resiliency or confidence, a lot of these are built in a very clunky way, I guess, ways that are not going to have much uptake. And so we, about a month ago, ran an ideation lab over a couple of days, and we had a strong contingent of youth people who were there as designers. But on the last day, we brought in about 40 or 50 teenagers from around the Boston area to come in and essentially serve as evaluators of this. And it was really, really clear. There was 4 innovations that were presented. And by and far, Faye, you were there, and I see you nodding a little bit. There was one that like everybody loved, right? As they were presenting, all the kids were nodding. They're like, I want this. I want to sign up. Like, it was an innovation that would plug into something like a Spotify, and it was connected to emotional intelligence and would play that type of music. And it really resonated with the youth in the room. And so for us, if we're running a market-based accelerator that wants to have these long-term solutions, tech solutions that can feed and provide positive experiences for young people, to do that without bringing in teens as kind of drivers and people that actually know what they want and know what they're going to need would be foolish. So we're continually learning in that process, and we'll continue to work with young folks to bring them in that way.
Thank you. So we've talked a little bit about youth agency and the other sort of dimension of young people is that they're situated in families and in schools and in other ecosystems. And I wonder if you guys could speak to this idea about who the stakeholders are. Who are the players sort of in the space of mental health and tech mental health for young people?
We changed the order, right? You guys want to go
I can
first?
start, sure. Yeah, well, so I have more of a public health perspective when it comes to this. I feel like it's everybody's responsibility, and I think a lot of what we're telling people to do right now is very much user-centric. Like, it's up to you to find those tools in your app and take off your notifications or take a mental health break. And I feel like that's a lot of pressure to put, especially on a young person who is, like, their brain is programmed to reach out and connect with their peers. So I think that everybody has a responsibility. There is some that we can do ourselves for our own well-being. Parents are clueless and scared and can't keep up with the pace of what's happening, and so don't know what to do. And I think there's also some misconceptions that they have about really being a trusted source on technology. I mean, it's ironic to me that we sort of helicopter our kids in so many domains of life, but not social media. Like, that's the one place we should be helicoptering our kids. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And I think also I would like to see more research and thought given to different socioeconomic strata for families, because I think a lot of the times we're telling parents, just engage with your kids in the media, and that's great. That's best case scenario, but I don't think that's reality for a lot of families. I think a lot of people that have kids would know that sometimes you're handing them technology to get yourself a break, or because maybe you don't have other things you can offer them, and that's the best leg up that you think that you're giving to your kids. So I think it's more complicated than that. I think schools also, digital literacy and media literacy needs to be woven into curricula. So I think they're still scrambling a little bit. So we need to put some more resources in place for them. And then I think industry has huge responsibility as well.
I think you covered a lot of what I would say as well, and so I'll make it brief. I think one thing to add on there that we're looking to is to influence a marketplace and to build an economy that's a little bit more focused on values and mission driven and impactful. And that might be a little bit naive, right? But you have to start somewhere, and I think you start with some powerful stories and some stories of success of innovators that are able to go out there, that are able to have a really big impact and to kind of provide a different kind of example of what social technologies can look like. For us, that means going out and working with investors to take a risk. It means providing some patient capital to look at different ways to make investments. It means working with innovators, and there's those types of innovators in the room now, to not just think that VC funding is the only pathway for success, and to work with them to find different routes to be successful. It also means looking at folks in the room to mean, hey, you're focused on privacy, you're focused on data. Like, what does it look like for well-being? And so to bring human capital into the conversation as well.
You know, just to paraphrase a lot of what you've said, it does take a village, you know. So just to give you as an example, the three of us were actually engaged in a design challenge innovation initiative with a high school called De Anza High School. It's in Richmond. It's a very diverse community of students. And in order to make that design challenge a success, not only did we have to work with the students themselves, it was the teachers, the principals, the school district, and then all of us bringing in mental health expertise, Second Muse bringing in that incubator expertise and those resources, us bringing in our youth outreach expertise and the design training expertise, and then going beyond that, what's the next stage and how does that play out? So it does take a village, you know. And I think here's a place where I think our tech sector can really learn from the social sector or the health sector, which is all of what we're talking about today in terms of influencers is really described in our determinants for health theories and practices. We've been doing that for a while, and it'd be great if there was a way for us to actually share some of that learning experience and decades of information with some of our tech partners.
So how do you think, so this is a good segue, right? So how would we acculturate technology companies to the social determinants of health, or to intersectionality, frankly, right?
Absolutely. I can start if that's okay. Yes, absolutely. Intersectionality is really quite important, right? Because when you're looking at health issues, there's so many factors influencing that specific behavior. And to really be very naive about it and just address one element is probably not going to work, right? So we recognized that working in the sector for a while, that there was a huge gap between our tech partners in the tech sector and the social sector and the health sector. So what we did around a year and a half ago, and I think both of you know this, we reached out to some partners in the tech industries and formed a technology advisory board. The intention of creating that board was to bring in members from the Googles and the Lyfts and the Ubers of the world and really initiate that dialogue that sort of bridges the gap, the information gap, the collaboration and communication gap that exists between the tech sector and our social sector. And that's been actually quite helpful and valuable in initiating those discussions and getting some of those players to the table to really have a dialogue on how we can use tech for youth and mental health.
So do you think that, given that the platforms or the tech companies are interested in engaging in a dialogue, do you think that youth can help push the platforms to different business models?
I'll take a stab. Well, I think for the first, the previous question, didn't mean to pass, but I think there is a certain amount of work that we do where there's a little bit of research involved, and so I think a lot of these tech companies are learning from us, right? And so to be able to communicate and to provide research on that, on these specific issues, is really important. On the business model question, I think it goes back to the first lightning talk of the day with Chris, and he talked about both the employees and the customers. And I think what you're starting to see is that generation of kids who have grown up with phones connected at all time are starting to go into the workforce. They're also starting to move into a place where they're consumers. And so as that starts to happen, they're starting to both enable this change from within, and they're also starting to influence this as customers. And so we're hopeful that youth who have grown up with tech and have seen both the positives and the negatives will embrace those positive things and build towards that. And I think that companies like, I think it was Twitter and Mara that was talking about this, companies that are able to demonstrate that they provide that value, that they provide and are thinking about this, will start to attract more talent, and that will ultimately, hopefully, start to influence some of these business models.
Yeah, I mean, I think with this techlash that we're kind of experiencing, I think that we collectively have an opportunity to sort of redefine what we value. And so that has to be at the core of changing any sort of business model. And some of you have probably seen the research that has come out about, Instagram is the platform that makes people's self-esteem plummet the most. So imagine if we had headlines that were saying Instagram is the platform where teens feel the most creative or the most empowered or develop the best, social skills or something. Like, that's what we should be competing around. But we have to put the value there rather than like this quantification value that we all have, which is number of likes or influencers or sponsors. So I think we need constituents to be the ones saying, shift these values and we will keep using your platform.
And just to build on that, I think, if I look back at around, say, 10 years ago, working with startups, we saw that even those startups that were in biomedical areas or health areas, they were predominantly being run by innovators. There was very little partnership with actual health experts or epidemiologists or statisticians or actually treatment providers. And that's changed significantly in the last decade. Now, as we are looking at new health startups and new innovations coming out in the sector, there is a lot of partnership with the experts. And I think that's really quite moving forward. Somebody's trying to cut me off. But I think in terms of business models, both the sectors have to redefine how we do our work. In the traditional nonprofit health sector, which is very, sort of founded in academia and evidence, there has to be an opportunity to be innovative and take risks in areas where we don't currently have evidence. So there needs to be some flexibility there. At the same time, in the tech sector, there has to be a focus on existing evidence to make sure that whatever they're building is based in deep science, and it's not just somebody sitting somewhere and coming up with an idea. Ideas are great, but at some point of time, we have to apply the lens of science. And the bottom line for that is less to do with the business model, but very much to do with the fact that you don't want to go out and do harm, right? That's the bottom line.
So that's interesting, given, so not thinking about young people 18 and under, but maybe just past 18 to 24s, with sort of this idea that anxiety on college campuses is really dramatic. There's been a dramatic uptick of suicide attempts and just pervasive anxiety on campuses, and what academia calls a mental health crisis on campuses. Do you think that there's a technology, tech campus academic research partnership that could be sort of exploited in a positive way to sort of ameliorate some of that?
Absolutely. I can start again. By virtue of being the oldest person on the panel, well, that was just you and I. So this is just to give you a very recent example, San Francisco State University, same issues in mental health, challenges on campus, the same issues with lack of resources to serve students that are either living on campus or off campus, the same challenges with the fact that most young people are still directly going to Google to search for signs and symptoms that they might be experiencing and find answers to that. There is no centralized place where a college student in San Francisco State can go and really get a science, evidence-based response to whatever they're going through, right? And that's a huge gap, not just here, but in many other places. In the past, we've done some work. For example, one of our partners has created this solution called Callisto. It is meant for reporting sexual assaults on campus. I'm sure you're aware of it. And that has been hugely successful in addressing the needs of young women and girls on campus who do experience assault. But coming back to San Francisco State, we are currently in a place of creating a partnership between my team, the clinical health services, mental health services providers on campus, the academia that exists within San Francisco State University, and academia that exists at UCSF. So this group of people is actually coming together to work with college students to design something that is integrated and comprehensive and provides a spectrum of services all the way from having basic, anxiety or behavioral issues all the way to psychosis, because the gap exists, the need exists, and that could be an example of these different entities from the tech and the academia and young people coming together to build something.
Yeah, I would just add that I think, as you pointed out, there is a huge crisis. Suicide rates, anxiety are all going up. There's also a shortage of mental health providers, especially on college campuses. So despite their will to really help the students, there's just not enough to meet the demand. And I think that's one opportunity where people see tech maybe stepping in as an interim measure while you're on a waiting list, or there's a lot of, peer-to-peer apps that are being developed that can kind of help in the meantime. But there's also a lot of loneliness that tech may or may not be contributing to. And I know Hope Lab is developing a loneliness app right now. And so I'm really interested to see what that looks like and how that impacts college students, because that's their main population.
Thanks. I want to ask our panelists one last question, then we'll open up for you guys to ask questions. We talked a little bit about stakeholders and having young people at the table. What role do you think, if any, regulation at either the very local level, right, the school level, at the state level, or at the federal level, what role could policy advocacy play in this sort of environment?
From our experience working at a state level, they're really hungry for innovations. I think they have some really big challenges that they've addressed. I think whether it's the construction of their system and how new projects get taken forward, whether it's a funding question, whether it's a legal question, they're so hungry for new innovations. And I actually think it's one of the more direct funding streams that a new innovator can look at is working at that federal or that state level, because there's so much anticipation for what can help their communities, and because there's a lot of attention that's being paid towards it right now.
A lot of people have talked about, some of the innovations happening in Europe, and I think that they are ahead of the game when it comes to looking at adolescence differently. And if you think about it, here we're kind of governed by COPA, right, where it's 13 and above kind of qualifies you as an adult, but really that's the start of adolescence. And at least in the mental health field, we consider the brain to still be growing until 25. So that's like almost in some ways a horrible time to be treating someone like an adult, and they're being handed a lot of adult content that they have to process without a lot of time to process that. So in Europe, there's like the Five Rights Foundation is one that's proposing this age-appropriate design code, which I find really interesting. I mean, I think we should look at something like that. So it's not like it's informed regulation where it's like age-appropriate, trying to design for what is healthy. And I think that we need to put health at the forefront and design around that. Because if you think about, I mean, this analogy is made all the time, but if you think about like the infrastructure we've built around automobiles and driving, I mean, there's a ton that we've put into that, and there's reasons for it, and it's not seen as this like repeal of rights. It's more like we know that your brain is not at a place where you're going to be safe until you're 16 or 18, and then you can't rent a car until you're 25. So there's reasons for all of that. There's people that are monitoring you. There's highway patrol. There's traffic lights. Like there's all this infrastructure, and I think we just need to do the equivalent for technology.
Just to build on that, there's this big conversation that's happening around ethics in our sector. One of the more recent conversations was based on this understanding that when you're working with young people, the stakes are different. For example, if you're working with young people who are above 18 years of age, the rules and regulations that apply are different. If it's under 18, minor consent laws, for example, that differ by state, right? Access to technology differs by school and by class and by teacher. All those things are realities of our life. So what is the challenge right now is that there's no consistent guidelines policy either from the state level or from the federal level, and that has to change, and it will change. A lot of work's happening there. But in the global sector, we recognize that a lot of our solutions are aimed towards addressing the mental health needs of young people that we consider vulnerable, right? And that can be defined differently in different contexts. But the bottom line is that we are working with a vulnerable community. So the responsibility is even higher, and the ethics that have to play into it are even higher. So a basic training on human subject protection should be probably compulsory for everybody who works with young people, right? And so this conversation has started globally. We are working with Gates Foundation and Population Services International and a few other organizations. And we've created this global group that's looking at ethics in the field of human-centered design. At the same time, we also recognize that a lot of times the vulnerabilities are defined by previous trauma, whatever form it might take. And a lot of times we work in the sector, and the people who are designing, developing, come with the best intentions, but they don't understand trauma-informed principles, practices, and methodologies. And they sometimes all the way from not recognizing when it happens or not recognizing when they're actually triggering a response to not knowing what to do when that happens. All of those things have to change. So we have initiated this whole trauma-informed, youth-centered health design process. We're bringing in experts both from a trauma field and the tech sector and the adolescent development sector to really have this conversation and define what that means, create a framework and a set of guidelines and practices. But all of that, none of that works till you actually are training the tech sector and the non-tech sector on these approaches. So that probably will be the final outcome of that process.
One of the things we talked about earlier, and Vicki mentioned, was it's not enough to sort of convene a focus group of young people about their anxiety or about their agency and not being able to turn off the app. We have to actually close them up right after we're finished, and meaning sort of opening things and not having the expertise. If something came up that you could imagine a designer not understanding how to sort of put someone back together, and being sort of empathic and sensitive to those needs. So I wanted to open it up for questions from our audience, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Vahid Razavi. Just wanted to say that 5 years ago, I tried to end my life by committing suicide. And that was as a result of working in the tech sector. And the folks at Stanford, I owe a lot to, because they put this Humpty Dumpty back together again with a cane. But what I also realized is I had some issues in terms of my mental health and dealing with it, that I had to get services at Stanford and elsewhere. I want people to know when you go to places like this, they provide some of the best care. but it needs to be opened up to the larger community. It seems that fundamentally there's a shortage of psychiatrists, clinicians, providers, and insurance is bigger and bigger and an issue every single day. For example, I can tell you that people that come off their COBRA, if they try to get covered California or Medicare, they can't access the same care that I can. And I think that's just unfortunate. So when we talk about mental health care, availability of resources, I think, is very key. Second thing I want to talk about is bullying. You mentioned online bullying. I want to know how the Be Best campaign by our First Lady, Melania Trump, is working out. And the reason there is, we have a leader in office that does online bullying, and I don't want to talk about politics necessarily, but it doesn't set a good example for future generations or this millennial. And I think they could get their communication skills from their parents and what they see acceptable in society. So if we don't tone it down, and if we can't at least try to act within reason online, how do we expect our kids to do it? So that's all I had.
Want me to respond? Yeah, I can just respond. I can say that I think Matt Soeth, who spoke downstairs right before this, from I Can Help, I think they are kind of a gold standard for addressing cyberbullying, and they work a lot with schools, and so I think more of that is great. And I was at their Digital for Good event last Monday, where they elevate 8 or 9 teens who have used tech for good, and so I think just making that groundswell take over for the negative. But again, going back to the guidelines, we need to have some enforceable guidelines. And then to your other point, I think you're absolutely right that there's a problem with access, and it's not going away. They've done projections to show that even if you hired as many psychiatrists as exist and psychologists, you would never fill the gap because the rates are rising so much. So I think that's why people are looking for some technology solutions. I know Harvard is working on a training of para-educators in India, where they're going to try to train peers to identify mental health symptoms as a first gap so that maybe more people can be caught early. But it's a huge problem in all of our work.
I think equity, that's pretty much the central point of everything that you said. And that plays out in our world, both in terms of tech, access, young people's health, etc. And that's more of a social approach, that's more of a systematic approach that needs to be changed. And I think a lot of players here are working on that, including yourself. So that needs to continue. It needs to be amplified. But I think there's an opportunity here for technology to be looking at what are some resource gaps that are creating gaps in service provision to our communities, right? And where can we come in? All the way from creating science-based, well-researched mental health assessment tools, right? So you can actually see where you're at, and giving young people the words and the language to describe what they're going through, that's really quite crucial. All the way from that to moving to a place where you can have a cognitive behavioral therapy-based chatbot. There are several that already exist out there, right? These aren't therapists, but they have been trained by therapists, and they are based in a treatment protocol that is science-based. So making that available for free for somebody who is not able to access a therapist or a counselor, and then at the other end, supporting some of the better mental health practices to reminders, medications, and otherwise, and then linking them to local services, to telemedicine, telecounseling. All of those three, I've thrown a lot of words at you, but those are important things that tech can bring in. And then, regarding the First Lady and her cyberbullying campaign, we do get a lot of funding from the feds, but I try to speak truth to the power, because I say every day for me is a career-ending opportunity. So I try to apply that and speak the truth. So that's total BS. And seriously, if you can't start something at home, how do you expect there to be a value attached to what you're doing? There's everybody looks at you and sees through the bullshit and says, well, what the F? Can I say the F word? But essentially, that's what it is, right? And we, as a community, have to do something, because young people are already in the streets and they're doing what they need to do. Yesterday was a big day for young people. I'm sure all of you are aware of this, but they are leading. And if young people have to go into the streets and do the things that we as adults should be doing, that is unacceptable, no matter what sector we are working in, right? So all of that to say, yes, there will always be time, circumstances, and events in our history where we will have this kind of leadership, and it is our duty to stand up to it, even if it means we're going to lose the funding, we're going to lose a job, or we are not going to be able to do what we need to do, but we have to be there for the right thing. And again, it's all very fluffy sounding words, but I think if you believe in it, we could potentially make that difference.
Thanks. I just want to add, there's other, they're called credible messenger models or peer support models, where we're training up, right, individuals who can go out into the community, because even if we produced armies of social workers, I'm rolling my eyes, I apologize, we still wouldn't be able to meet demand. And so there's a program, a psychiatry program in Nigeria that is training grandmothers to go out into rural communities and be empathic listeners. And this is going to get super nerdy, there's a 10-question Beck depression inventory, and they train them up, and they use some telehealth models to supervise them. And those women are trusted in their community, and so they're leveraging their social capital to sort of provide a need and plug a gap that professionals may not be able to manage. Other questions?
Great. Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for your passion and for your expertise in leading the way in this really crucial topic. I'd like to pivot back to the prior question about that had public health and policy insinuations. And more specifically, public health, I agree 100% in terms of this being a true public health issue. And when we look at public health policy, public health legislation, fundamentally there's a behavioral change component that's attached to it. And the reason why those laws are in place is to, if you look at the intent of the legislation, it's to improve and support the health and well-being of that relative constituency. So what I'm really curious about is whether it's through the youth-led adult-assisted initiatives that you've done, whether it's through working specifically with school districts, specific schools, local city councils, et cetera, what policies have you seen or are emerging that are out there that are in place specifically to address the mental health and well-being of young people? I know, for example, this is not a municipal law. I believe it's Sequoia High School in Redwood City. Their school voted, that's my understanding, the students and the teachers alike, that the students wanted to put their phones away in their locker. Like basically there was no phone policy from the beginning of school to the end of school, because it was becoming such an intense attention distraction and impeding their ability to learn. So that was obviously a school initiated rather than a legislative policy. So again, to repeat the question is, what have you seen or what's emerging that could evolve into policy you think would be beneficial that supports the health and well-being of young people, as well as is evidence-based, because that's a huge component of being successful public health legislation. Thanks so much.
I think I know San Mateo Union High School. I don't know if I think that's the one you're thinking of. Yeah. And so we're all kind of watching to see how that goes. And I think that it's great that the principal took that stand. And I know that both Common Sense Media's education director, and I spoke with Denise Clark-Pope from Challenge Success yesterday to ask what her position was on that. And I think not everyone supports a full ban of phones because they want the students to be able to utilize them for educational purposes. But I think definitely leaning towards that end, but putting in some very strong guidelines about usage is a great thing to explore. And I think that there's a lot of distraction that's happening. And really, if you're there to learn, minimizing that distraction is a great way to do that. And it's not so much a policy that's been passed, but I'm also very encouraged by the pilot that's going on. I think they're piloting it in Canada with Instagram taking away the likes. They are trying that with a small population up there. And so taking off some of those measures, because I think that what we're seeing is that really the interactions that are happening for a lot of young people are it's the extrinsic value versus the intrinsic. And so you're sort of losing the connections that you went on there for in the first place. And it's becoming this status game where they'll take off a post if it doesn't have enough likes because of how that's perceived. And so you're just sort of getting away from yourself. And I think that's really feeding into some of the self-esteem issues and anxiety that we're seeing. So I'm really encouraged by something like that. And I think that actually came up in the innovation event that I did with some young people at Hack Mental Health, as they were like, just take off comments, take off likes. Why do we need that? Why do we need a like button? You know, and it's just such a simple thing, but there's a whole culture built up around it. So trying some things like that could really make a huge difference.
This is definitely not our expertise, and so one quick answer to that and then an invitation. Well, we have started to see a lot of school districts and even state levels that are starting to build this into a mandatory part of their curriculums, and so it is an opportunity. And so we have a program in Southwest Florida in Fort Myers that works on economic development in that community, and so we're tying the innovation program that we run around youth mental well-being with the work that they're doing, and I think that's starting to pop up in more and more places. But the invitation, because that's just a small piece, is that folks that are passionate about that do have that expertise, like, we would love to have a conversation with you, because our program is built around this community coming from different perspectives to have those types of conversations. And we are not the experts. You all are the experts, and you all have informed our program to this point and will continue to inform it the whole way. So that is an open invitation, and would love to hear if people do have strong takes on that.
If I may just add a few more things to that. Again, I think this is a matter where science also plays a big role, right? So how you treat these rules and regulations for a 10 to 14-year-old is different from a 15 to 18-year-old. It's going to be different from a 21 to 28-year-old. So we have to be nuanced in our approach in terms of what's really happening. For example, if you are looking at the behaviors of a 12-year-old on a device, you have to be looking at how they are looking, how they're absorbing, and how they are structuring that information and what are they taking away from it. And it's going to be different from a 22-year-old looking at the same piece of information on the same device, right? So how does that play out? So the bottom line is that we as experts, I use that very loosely, we as people who want to work with the community, we have to build the evidence, right? And in the good old days, that used to work well. The gold standard was a randomized controlled trial, and that showed evidence, and we could take it to a policymakers, congressman, and initiate a bill, which, by the way, creating a bill in your local, that's a whole different conversation. But that is not true anymore, because a standard RCT that might take 4 to 5 years, by the time you come out with the results, the whole tech sector has changed. The device has changed, the platforms has changed, how you interact on the platforms changed. So the way we build evidence also has to change and has to become much more rapid, right? And at the same time, we need to be educating our policymakers, because a lot of people who are in those places to initiate those bills and to push them through Congress or legislation are people who don't completely understand technology. If anybody of you, any one of you saw Mark Zuckerberg's testimony at Congress, you will agree with me that most of the questions that they were asking were written by the young staffers. I assure you, none of the questions were written by them, because when they had to ask a follow-up question, that clearly identified that you had no idea of what you're asking for. So I think there has to be a big social change. But if at the center we keep evidence and science, I think we'll be able to be successful.
I think we have time for one last question.
Hi, my name's Loren, and I'm from Australia, and I work with Indigenous populations in Australia. I'm really curious around the definitions of well-being and the co-design processes that might be taking place in your different initiatives to really define what lens on well-being you're trying to tackle. And I suppose the reason I ask that is we're sort of doing some work in this space in terms of what the Indigenous lens on well-being is and means, before even being able to do anything in terms of an initiative, really trying to understand what that term means. So I'd really be interested in any of your experiences in defining the well-being field for your constituents or like your clients, and how that interacts with your co-design processes.
Absolutely. A very quick example of how that plays out, because how our community defines well-being is really crucial, because we might look at it from a outsider perspective and think that it's a problem, but when we go into the community, they might actually say that actually it's not a problem, the problem actually lies somewhere else. We were working in Alameda County, not too far from here, on preventing unplanned teen pregnancies, and our funder, the federal funder, came to us and said, we want you to work with the Latino Latino girls and women and do pregnancy prevention. passion, right? And we want you to go there and use technology and social media to tell them that having children as a teenager is a bad thing. You won't be able to pursue your life goals. You won't be able to pursue education, and your life is going to be over the moment you have a child. And we were like, well, that's your perspective, so let's go and do our due diligence. So we went into the community because we had some members from the community part of our team, and they said, this sounds like hokey pokey. This doesn't sound right based on my cultural context. So we went, and that was true. All the young ladies, young women, and girls that we talked to, they all said having a child as a teenager doesn't prevent me from pursuing my life goals. That is not true for my community because I have so much support in my family that I can still attend school. I can still pursue jobs and careers. All those things are true. So if we were to frame that campaign or that technology based on this negative perspective and spin, that would have actually ended up creating a gap between us and the community, and we would never have been able to work in that community again or gain that trust back. So again, to your exact point, I'm not answering your question, I'm just reinforcing your point, which is well-being and how these health issues play out in different communities so different. And if we go in and apply our expert lens to it, we are very likely to create harm and fail.
I also see a time's up sign back there, and so I'm not sure how much we want to respect that. But it's been an evolution for us, going from suicide, anxiety, depression, to being centered around how do we create meaningful connections, how do we build protective factors like anxiety or like resiliency, ease with self, confidence, and now it's moving even more into how do we provide spaces for creativity, for joy, for building, for those types of things. And so I think we're expanding as we learn and grow in this space. Love to talk after because we also have an Indigenous program running in Australia.
So I think we've gotten the hook. Thank you, my panelist colleagues. Thank you for joining us, and feel free to come up and ask questions because we're out of time. Thanks.